So in the previous video, we saw that most parts of the brain have a left half and a right half. Like those lobes of the cerebral cortex that make up the fancy outer layer of our brain, does all that cool stuff. We've got a left occipital lobe and a right occipital lobe, a left frontal lobe and a right frontal lobe. Thankfully, they communicate and they work together thanks to the corpus callosum, because otherwise without, it connecting things, it'd be more like having two separate brains doing their own thing. And indeed, that's what we're going to focus on in this video. So occasionally, people have to have surgery that'll completely sever their corpus callosum, basically removing the connection between the left half and the right half of the cerebral cortex. Now, why would that be? Generally, it's to treat like severe seizures, like intractable epilepsy that can't be fixed by other means. We've tried other things, we can't, and this is like the fallback treatment. This is actually a lot less common as a treatment today, but it may still be used in extreme cases. Now, just a reminder before we dive into this, we saw before that the left hemisphere is the one most important and most dominant for language and speech type of tasks, right? So left goes with language, L with L, to remember that. Also, you might remember that the brain is wired contralaterally for most of our senses and for controlling our limbs and things like that. So what you see off in the right visual field, things off in your right periphery, those all go and get processed in the left hemisphere of your brain and vice versa. So keep those two facts in mind as we talk about this interesting phenomena that we see in split brain patients, people who have had their corpus callosum removed. So we can actually learn a lot about how brains normally work by investigating what happens in someone whose brain is no longer communicating across the two sides. Basically looking at these patients to understand how brains normally function when they do have the corpus callosum. So cognitive psychologists have done a lot of experiments testing these patients. Often that might involve having them come into a lab and they sit down in front of a computer where we have them stare at a fixation point at the center of a screen in front of them so that we can flash some pictures, like to one side of the screen or the other, and we'll know if we have them staring at the fixation point, then we know which hemisphere that visual information ended up in due to that well-known contralateral setup of the brain. So for example, we could put a red square in their left visual field, like you can see here, to the left of the fixation point that they're staring at. And that info is going to end up in the right hemisphere of their brain. It'll end up contralateral, opposite side. Meanwhile, anything in their right visual field, like the blue circle here, will end up going to their left hemisphere. Now that's the case for all of us, for all of our brains. But with a split brain patient, those two hemispheres can't share their information with each other. It's stuck on the side that it went to. So in a test, in a laboratory, we might flash a word on the right visual field, like the word face here in this picture. So we know it goes to their left hemisphere. So if we ask them out loud to say what word they saw, they will say face. Just like any of us would, right? It's straightforward, right? You flash the word face in front of them, you ask what word they saw, they say face. That makes sense because the left hemisphere is the one that's dominant for language. So that verbal left hemisphere, that verbal left half of the brain got access to the word, right? Because things in the right visual field do go to the left part of the brain, and thus it can easily tell us the word that it saw. But here's where it gets nuts. If we flash the word on the left visual field, so off to their left periphery, it now travels into the right hemisphere of the brain. So the right half of their brain saw the word face. But if you ask them out loud, what did you see? What word did you see? They say nothing. They'll be like, nothing's come up on the screen yet. They haven't seen anything, which is super weird, right? They're looking right at it. But remember, their left hemisphere, the left half of their brain, which is the more verbal side, it hasn't seen anything, right? Its side of space is empty. So of course they'll say out loud that they haven't seen anything. The language part of their brain hasn't seen anything. But we know the info did get into their right brain. We know it's in their right hemisphere. So we could ask them, say, to draw what they saw using their left hand. And now the person can draw a face. Or if the word was chair, they draw a chair. If the word was house, they draw a house. All while verbally telling us they didn't see any word flash on the screen. Now, why do we have them use their left hand to draw here, right? This might be a right-handed person. They might suck at drawing, but we'll still have them use their left hand to draw what they saw. Why? Because that's the hand controlled by the right hemisphere of the brain. Our motor actions, our movements, are also contralateral. Right hemisphere controls the left arm and the left hand. So motor actions, that's efferent signals sent out to control the body, they're also contralateral. So it can draw what the right brain knows. Left hand draws what the right brain has seen. And if we ask them to draw with the right hand, that's the one controlled by the left half of the brain, which hasn't seen anything. So if you ask them to draw with the right hand, they have no idea what to draw, right? They just sit there with a blank sheet of paper, no idea. Likewise, if we take, in like an experiment, might take two pictures and combine them. Like in this here, we've combined the eye and the insect, kind of flash a picture like this on a screen really briefly. Again, with their eyes fixating on a fixation point in the middle of the screen, so we know which part of this image goes to which hemisphere. In that case, ask them out loud and they'll say they saw an eye because the eye is on the right side, so it went to the left hemisphere. That's the language dominant hemisphere. Now, let's see this in action with one of the pioneers in studying split brain patients. He's named Michael Gazzaniga, and you'll meet one of his patients here in the video who has collaborated with him for years and years.
We began our journey into the human brain here on the campus of Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. I'd come to meet one of the world's leading brain scientists, Mike Gazzaniga, and a man he's worked with for over a decade. A man with two brains.
You've been working a long time with Dr. Gazzaniga?
14 or 15 years.
It doesn't seem like that long, does it?
The collaboration began when Joe had surgery.
And you had this procedure to correct an epileptic problem,
Yes.
Is that right?
Trying to stop the seizures. I was having seizures like every day or so, or sometimes 2 or 3 a day.
To control Joe's epileptic seizures, a surgeon severed the connection between the two halves of his brain. Cutting the corpus callosum like this prevented the spread of the electric storms that caused his seizures. But it also prevented the left and right halves of his brain from communicating with each other. In the years since the operation, Joe's epilepsy has been under control. He now earns a living at an egg farm, and in his everyday life, he's largely unaffected by the fact that his left and his right brains work independently.
Do you feel any different when you think about something than you did? Any differently from the way you felt before the procedure?
It's just got a backup brain, that's all.
That's something everybody could use, right?
I found out how true that was right away when I was asked to draw a different shape with each hand. In a brain like mine, roughly speaking normal, at least all in one piece, the left half of my brain controls the right side of my body, while the right brain controls the left side.
Oh, no.
But because the two halves are connected,
Nothing wrong with that.
getting each hand to work independently isn't easy.
Well, we're seeing the fact that Alan's hemispheres are connected, and that the motor messages from one are confusing the motor messages in the other.
I was just drawing an upside-down duck.
Okay.
But when Joe is given the same task, his two hands operate as if controlled by two separate brains. What's happening is that each half of Joe's brain is given a separate instruction. He's asked to fix his eyes on the cross in the center of the screen. Anything flashed to the right of the cross goes only to his left hemisphere. Things to the left go to his right hemisphere. Because the two don't communicate, each hand does only what its half of the brain sees.
Wow, look at that. It's really like two different people doing the same.
That's right.
Same task.
That's the idea.
Okay, Joe, I want you to keep your hands out in front
In
of
an
you.
experiment that's now a classic in brain research, Mike Gazzaniga over 30 years ago used a similar setup to find out if the two halves of the brain are specialized to do different things.
Ship.
Joe is being flashed a word only to one half of his brain. Words flashed to the right
Storm.
are seen only by his left brain, and Joe can report seeing those words just fine.
Piano.
Good.
But when a word is flashed to his right brain,
Didn't see that.
Okay. Joe, I'm going to ask you
but now watch what happens.
to draw that with your left hand.
You're gonna be lost.
Why don't you try drawing another picture of it over here if that'll help you.
Oh, phone.
Oh, okay.
Durr.
It's almost as though somebody has given him a secret communication.
That's
and
right.
Now he knows that it's a telephone. But up until then, he was blind to it.
Exactly.
When Gazzaniga first did this experiment, it instantly proved that the ability to speak resides almost exclusively in the left hemisphere. Not until he sees what his right brain is drawing is Joe able to name
He
it.
said church, didn't he?
After looking at the picture.
Yeah, but he had it figured out about as long as we did. That's really interesting. It's a picture here of somebody communicating almost with another person.
And the communication is not occurring inside the head, it's occurring out on the piece of paper.
Yeah.
Blob. I really don't know.
You want to draw a little bit more?
So far, Joe has been seeing only one word.
Cat. That's a cat
Things get
sound.
even stranger when he's flashed two words, each to only one half of his brain.
The right hemisphere saw toad. And
And so his left hand draws a toad.
So there's the toad.
Oh, it's a toad.
And this time I was able to guess what was coming.
Will
Now-
they put a little three-legged stool in there later, or what?
Joe's speaking left brain saw a stool. Saying the word lets the hand that's controlled by his right brain in on the secret.
That's great. That's really interesting. And if he had seen that with the corpus callosum intact, he would have drawn a toadstool.
Right.
Not a toad and a stool.
Right, exactly the point. I've been doing this for 35 years. Yeah.
And
It gets me every time.
Yeah, it must. It must.
This time, instead of naming the word, I want you to point to the word.
Again, Joe sees two words simultaneously. Bell goes to his non-speaking right brain. Music to his speaking left brain. When asked to point to a picture of what he saw, he chooses Bell. But when asked why,
Okay, why'd you pick that one?
Music.
Music?
and when asked to explain,
There was music and bell, and it was a few minutes ago. Last time I heard any music was coming from the bells out here,
Uh-huh.
banging away.
So the bell's
Yeah.
outside here.
So, look good enough answer to me.
what's extraordinary is that Joe's speaking left brain concocts a plausible story of why he pointed to Bell, even when some of the other pictures more obviously represent music. Gazzaniga believes this determination to find cause and effect, this desire to explain, is the left hemisphere's most marvelous property.
One of the unique things to the human brain is this need to interpret why two events occurred. What was the antecedent to this? What caused this? And if you can imagine that a species like us that has that little chip in its brain that asks those questions is going to survive rather well, because it's going to figure out more about the nature of the world than a species that doesn't have that.
Okay, Joe, I want you to keep your hand.
But as I was about to discover, the right brain has a very useful survival skill all its own.
Figure.
What do you think will happen here?
So for you, we're doing a live experiment. Never done it before.
The experiment involves the 16th century Italian painter Arcimboldo, who made faces out of fruit, flowers, meat, even books. From other research, there's reason to believe that the ability to recognize faces is located exclusively in the right hemisphere. So Mike wondered if Arcimboldo's paintings would look different to each of Joe's two brains.
So will his left hemisphere say, I saw a potato, I didn't see a face? And will his right hemisphere say, I saw the face, and not comment on the fact it was made out of a potato?
You're going to see a figure followed by a choice of two words.
If this works, it'll be terrific, but we'll see. So here it is, live.
Okay?
The first painting goes to the right hemisphere. And Joe points to
Point
face.
down.
The next painting goes to his left brain. And this time he points to fruits. Mike seemed pleased.
Are you having a moment?
This is too good.
Again to the right brain, and Joe sees it as a face.
Point it down.
But to the left brain,
Face made out of books.
Point it out.
What are the books?
Are you happy with what you're
Fruit.
seeing?
It's unbelievable. He's doing it. You see that?
It's going so fast, it's shifting from left to right so fast, I can't keep up with you. You're used to looking at this.
When you show him a face in the right side, the left hemisphere,
Yeah.
he's focusing in on the elements that made up the face.
Yeah.
When you show him the exact same picture in the left field going to the right hemisphere, he's focusing on the face and not the elements.
And not the elements. If you came down from another planet and you saw faces and vegetables, you might not think there was much of a difference among them. But the brain seems to be made up in a certain way to say faces are very different from other objects.
That's right.
And one side of the brain specializes in faces.
Exactly right. Exactly right. It is an adaptation that we have to detect upright faces. It's a very important. You can imagine in an evolutionary time that all of a sudden you have the ability to detect quickly an upright face. You want to read the expression on that face. You want to know if it's friend or foe. You want to have a set of questions about that face.
So freaking mind-blowing, right? And as you saw, Joe's pretty normal in his day-to-day life. So without testing this stuff in a controlled lab setting, we might never realize all these subtle but important things about how the brain works. But here we've got this clear confirmation that the left hemisphere is more dominant for language tasks, the right for some other stuff, including being heavier for face processing. But more importantly, by seeing what happens when the two halves of the brain don't coordinate and communicate, we can come to understand how a normal brain functions when it does coordinate. Now, let's see an experiment used in one of Gazzaniga's classic studies. So in one experiment, what they do with a split brain patient was flash different words to each side of the screen, like key in the left visual field, meaning it goes to the right hemisphere of the brain, and ring on the right, meaning it goes to the left hemisphere of the brain. So in condition 1, we might tell the subject to use his left hand to grab the thing that matches what word he saw. Sure enough, he'll feel around at some objects that are behind a barrier and quickly pick out the key, because that's what that part of his brain saw. But in condition 2, we might ask the subject to name the word he saw. And now, since that's a left hemisphere thing that does the talking, right? Left half of the brain is the verbal half. Then the left hemisphere is going to share what it knows. And so the subject says ring, because that's what the left hemisphere saw. Likewise, if we'd asked them to feel around with their right hand, they would pick up a ring rather than a key. So studies like this show us that the hemispheres are specialized, and they confirm things like the left hemisphere being dominant for language. So these are really important, kind of groundbreaking studies in the understanding of how the brain is organized. Now, just to test your understanding, if I flash this picture in front of a split brain patient who's fixating on a white dot there in the middle, what would she say that she saw? Like if I ask her out loud, pause the video for a moment and just pick your answer. Okay, and what would she point to afterward with her right hand? If I ask her, point to what you saw using your right hand. Again, pause and just pick your answer here. And finally, what would she point to afterward if I ask her to point with her left hand? Once again, pause the video and pick your answer. So, out loud, when asked to say it out loud, she would say apple because it went to her left hemisphere. Remember, contralateral processing means things on your right visual field go to the left brain. And since her left brain saw an apple, she'll also point to the apple if you ask her to use her right hand, since that's the hand her left brain controls. Only when we ask her to point with her left hand would she choose the wrench, because that's the part seen by the right half of her brain. Now, another experimental design we've used with split brain patients is called a chimeric face test, which is just where we put two half faces together into an image. It's named after the mythical creature called a chimera, which was a mix of like a dragon, a lion, and a goat. Or you may have heard the term if you've seen a chimeric cat, which is just what you call cats with a pattern like this. So anyway, in the laboratory, we present this stimuli, a chimeric face like this one up top. We present that to a split brain patient, where again, they have to fixate in the middle, where you see that black dot in the middle between the two halves of the face, okay? Now, if they're asked to say whether the picture we flashed was a man or a woman, they'll say it's a man. But the man is in the right visual field, right? It's going to the linguistic left hemisphere. That's what we'd expect. But if after flashing the picture, you show them maybe a complete picture of a woman and a complete picture of a man, like just, the two full images that we mixed here. Show them the woman, show them the man, have them just point to which one they saw previously. They'll usually raise their left hand and point to the woman's face because her image went to the right hemisphere, which is a little more dominant for face processing, and the same hemisphere that controls the left hand contralaterally. Same idea if we use different facial expressions on each side. Like one part of the brain here would pick up the smile and the other part picks up neutral. And we'll get different answers about how friendly the person was. When again, the face was just flashed really quick on a screen. Answer, how friendly was that face that you just saw briefly? And we'll get different answers depending on which hemisphere we probe, right? Whether we do it verbally or ask them to use their right or left hand to answer. By the way, I briefly mentioned earlier that our sense of smell, what's called olfaction, is not contralateral, unlike all of our other senses. So stuff in your right nostril actually goes to the right side of your brain, unlike our other senses. So imagine as an experiment, I take a split brain patient like this and I blindfold them, and then I fully plug their left nostril. And now that their left nostril is totally closed, they only have the right nostril open, maybe I put the scent of a rose in their right nostril. I could then ask them, what do you smell? Looking for a verbal answer, right? Or alternatively, I could ask them, pick the object they smelled from an array of objects I've put in front of them, which includes a rose, among a bunch of other objects. And what do you think they would do in condition 1, where I'm asking them out loud, versus what do you think they would do in condition 2? You might pause the video and work this out before I give the answer. Well, as I've said before, smell goes to the same side since it's the one sense that isn't contralateral. So the rose scent hits their right hemisphere, right? It stays on the right side. Meanwhile, their left hemisphere, the language part of the brain, the language heavy hemisphere, it got no smell at all because its nostril was plugged. So if you ask them to say out loud what they smelled, they'll deny smelling anything. They'll say, I didn't smell a thing. When you ask them, though, to pick out the object, their left hand is going to accurately grab the rose. Again, if you have them use their left hand. If you force them to use their right hand, though, then they'll grab an object at random because the part of the brain that controls their right hand has no information about any smelled object, right? So the same principle follows as in the other split brain tasks, but in this case, we just have to remember that smell didn't start off in the opposite hemisphere because that sense isn't contralateral. Meanwhile, there are some really interesting philosophical implications here. If you think about this stuff very much, I'll actually let YouTuber CGP Grey explain the issue.
Your brain is two brains, two hemispheres, each doing half the work of being you. Half your vision goes to each and half your movement directed by each. Right controls left and left controls right. Your two brains coordinate through a wire of nerves, but this wire can be cut and was, for a time, used as an epilepsy treatment. After the cut, people seemed the same, though their brain was split in twain. Except some post-split patients describe that while selecting their morning outfit with right hand, left might come along to disagree. Actually, left hand might quite often disagree, which these split brain patients found frustrating. What's happening? To investigate, remember, right brain sees and controls one half, while left brain controls and sees the other. But only left brain can speak.
Hello.
Because that's where the speech center is located. Right brain without this is mute. In normal brains, this doesn't matter because each half communicates across the wire with the other. But split brains can't, and thus you can show just the right brain a word, ask the person, what did you see, and you'll hear
Nothing.
because left speaking brain saw nothing. Meanwhile, right brain will use its hand to pick the object out of a pile hidden from left brain. This is deeply creepy. Ask why are you holding the object, and speaking left brain will make up a plausible sounding but totally wrong reason.
I always wanted to learn how to solve one of these.
Left brain isn't lying, it's just doing what brains do, creating a story that explains its past actions to its current self. A behavior which does rather cast doubt onto the notion of free will, but that's a story for another time. Creating reasons for why it does things is just something left brains do. It happens in normal, healthy humans all the time, and if you think about it closely, you know you've done this. Back to experiments. Give right brain an object, ask the person what's in your hand, and they won't be able to say.
I'm not holding anything.
And when asked to draw, a split brain can draw two separate objects simultaneously with each hand in a way unsplit brains find challenging. These experiments on split brain patients are deeply unsettling because they really point in the direction of a mute, separate intelligence, something living in the skull. You can even ask questions of a split brain and get disagreement on the answer. So if your brain is split, who is the you in this situation? From the outside, it's tempting to think of the part of the brain that's speaking as the person, but something is hearing and answering questions. And though right brain can't speak, it does understand faces, which left brain can't. If this is you, you don't know who your friends and family are in a crowd. This act of cutting exposes two minds in one head, and the talking mind doesn't know there's someone else in the house. The left brain can describe the situation it's in, but nonetheless will constantly be surprised by right brain's actions and explain them away. There's a question to be asked here. Why, after separation, does right brain not totally freak out, but instead plays along helpfully, answering questions and listening to left brain's dumb stories about what's happening?
It's the best pony? I don't know.
Speculation time, but one answer is the cutting doesn't make right brain a separate intelligence, consciousness, person, but rather it has always been. In normal people, perhaps right brain grows up as a companion without a choice, feeling at first somewhat equal partners, but then as speech develops that it can't participate in, that increasingly becomes the central point of life, it resigns to mutely coordinate with left brain. At this moment in your normal head, there are two of you watching this video. One having a mind equals blown moment, and the other mentally rolling its eye at the obviousness of it all. In split brains, right doesn't freak out because not a whole lot has really changed. You might not agree and may be arguing right now why it can't be possible. Exactly as we would expect talking left brain to do. Speculation aside, split brain patients show at the very least that in the mind there is a separate something that can hear and understand and respond given the right circumstances. Your brain isn't entirely yours. Who is you? You is two.
Yeah, so this isn't just wild philosophical musings. Like, exploring this stuff scientifically is a big part of figuring out the most basic workings of our brain and where our sense of self comes from. We also see similar confabulation by the left hemisphere and things like selfhood mysteries like this in some patients who have had a stroke in the right hemisphere of their brain. Like, when that happens, depending on where the stroke hit in the right hemisphere, they can end up with something like temporary paralysis in their left arm and their left leg, since that's the part controlled by the right brain, right? And if another area in the right hemisphere also happens to be damaged, they might not even recognize that the left half of their body is paralyzed. Like, they have a condition called anosognosia, where they're just not aware of the fact that they have this condition, that they're paralyzed. You can ask that person to high-five you with their left hand, and it just sits there unmoving. But ask them verbally if they're high-fiving you, and they'll say, hold on, the hand's coming, hold on. Or when they can't do it, right? They don't even recognize anything's wrong. Their verbal left brain might confabulate. It'll make up a story. So they'll say things like, I'm calling up my arm, just a second. Or it's tired. Or even say that they did the high five with you already. And some such patients won't even recognize the left hand as part of their body. And when asked whose hand they're looking at, they'll confabulate. They'll say, that's your hand, doc, or that's my mom's hand. I would know it anywhere. Or this hand belongs to the guy in the next hospital bed over. All of this because the left brain is our storyteller. It tries to like weave our moment-to-moment experience into a coherent narrative, but without necessarily doing any reality checking like the right hemisphere would normally do. By studying situations like this where the brain is functioning abnormally, we start to understand all the crazy shit the brain is doing behind the scenes in a normal brain all day long. Stuff that's so obvious we don't even realize it's a brain function. Like giving us a unified, coherent sense of self, or recognizing what is or isn't part of me. And this stuff may also make us question some of our most basic assumptions about personhood and identity. For example, in conjoined twins, each person has their own name, right? They're their own person. They may develop, different preferences and things. Hell, they might end up with different partners or spouses. We generally have no problem thinking of conjoined twins as two different people, even though they might share, say, the same heart, or a single set of lungs, or control the same set of legs. Likewise, if someone has one head, just one brain, but maybe two torsos and two sets of arms and two sets of legs, if they have one head and one brain, we have no problem seeing that as a single identity, a single person, right? We just give them one name. Indeed, Lakshmi Tatma, she was born with 4 arms and 4 legs not too long ago, because she was one of a pair of conjoined twins, but the other conjoined twin was actually headless, didn't have a brain because the head atrophied in the womb and didn't develop at all. So we got here a person with one brain, one person, one name, one identity, right? Whereas those ladies above, we've got two brains. So two people, two names, two identities. It's all pretty straightforward. But what about craniopagus twins? This is a rare version of conjoined twins where they may share the same brain or large parts of their brains overlap. For example, there's a case study where one twin was blindfolded, yet able to say out loud what was seen through the other twin's eyes. A sort of directly shared sensory experience. Could it be that identity or individuality is more of a spectrum than a binary, than a yes-no? Like, if two bodies share a single head and a single brain, it's definitely one person, right? If a single body shares two heads and two different brains, it's definitely two people. But nature isn't always as binary as that, and it can help us maybe to rethink some of the assumptions we have about how brains work and what it means for a brain, for a person, to see or think or decide or have other cognitions. And as we see with split brain patients, we may need to rethink our own brains, every brain, which may not be as singular as we assume either. Now, getting back to lab studies, by the way, there is one benefit that split brain patients have over those of us with the corpus callosum. Since their hemispheres are effectively processing things independently, they're in some sense seeing more at a time, even when looking at the same display. Like, each hemisphere can attend to different parts of an image. That's what I mean by dual focus of attention. So it turns out if you give them a task like finding a visual target in a group of items, they perform it quicker than control participants. Now, just some quick side notes about split brain patients. First off, the right hemisphere does have some involvement in language. How else could it understand the instructions to pick an object with its left hand, right? So when we say language is in the left hemisphere, we really just mean the left hemisphere tends to be more dominant for language tasks, though the right hemisphere is normally plenty involved. Also, even with no corpus callosum for direct connections between the cerebral hemispheres, there are still some minor subcortical connections. Subcortical means below the cortex. Like, remember the limbic system? That's subcortical, and it has some connections from the left to the right that are deeper inside the brain, right below where the corpus callosum was. There's also some of what we call cross-cueing. Basically, when the left hemisphere makes up and confabulates a wrong verbal answer because it didn't see anything on its side of the visual field, so the left hemisphere is just making shit up, what happens sometimes is the right hemisphere, which does know the answer, might make the person's face frown, right? Because the right hemisphere realizes, oh God, they're giving the wrong answer. So the person frowns, but if you ask them why, they can't tell you why they're frowning. Also, there's something called the helping hand phenomenon. Sometimes if one hemisphere is making the wrong answer, the hand that knows the right answer may try to correct the other hand. Like we saw in that video with the protein bars, the hands may actually disagree in some sense. Now, during day-to-day activities, the left hemisphere is dominant for most split brain patients. And in fact, the same is true for us, for healthy controls. Our left hemisphere tends to be dominant over the right for a lot of day-to-day stuff, like if we give the hemispheres conflicting info. So for split brain patients, their left hemisphere dominates in a lot of basic life stuff. But during harder tasks and things involving emotion, for example, we're more likely to get this cross-cueing and this helping hand phenomenon and other interactions like that. Indeed, here's an example from Sperry and colleagues back in 1979 in a case study they wrote up. The patient was shown an array of photos that happened to include his aunt. So there are a bunch of photos of people, and somewhere in there's one familiar person, his aunt. He was asked if one of the photos in this array was familiar, and he pointed to his aunt. And then the experimenter asked, is this person you pointed to a neutral, a thumbs up, or a thumbs down person? And the patient makes a thumbs up and said, this is a happy person. The experimenter then asked, do you know him personally? And the patient says, oh, it's not a him, it's a her. And the experimenter asks if she's an entertainment personality or a historical figure. And the patient goes, no, just, and they go, someone you know personally? And the patient then used his left index finger to trace on the back of his right hand. Remember, the right hand connects to the verbal part of the brain, the left hemisphere. So he used his left index finger to trace on the back of his right hand and then exclaimed, "My Aunt Eddie!" When asked how he knew, he said by the E traced on the back of his right hand. Now, this is true for all of us, by the way. For simple tasks, we often process fastest in one hemisphere, while for complex tasks, we generally recruit both hemispheres. So that's true not just of split brain patients, but also of us. But in healthy brains with the corpus callosum, those two hemispheres can also coordinate a lot more. Now, just a couple more general side notes about hemispheric specialization in all of our brains before we end this video. First off, women on average have a little less hemispheric specialization compared to men. Not a huge difference, but it is a consistent difference. Also, a few people, some humans, have their sides flipped, meaning language is in their right half of the brain and face processing is more in their left half of their brain, kind of just a mirror image of the quote-unquote normal brain, the opposite of what we see in most brains. Turns out this is most likely to happen in a left-handed person, but that's even though most left-handers still have the usual layout. So this is still really rare. Yes, it's more likely to happen in a left-hander than a right-hander, but even most left-handers have this normal layout with language on the left. So we'll just assume that's kind of the default. At any rate, it's rather rare. It happens enough that we might screen for it, or at least screen for left-handedness before doing like a brain scan study in cognitive neuroscience experiments. All right, regardless, overall, the pattern of specialization holds across age, across culture, across everything else. So we can make this kind of broad generalization about language being in the left hemisphere and face processing being heavier in the right hemisphere and such. However, an important caveat, as you see here, just to add some nuance so we don't overblow these results, a lot of tasks and functions have no real difference between the hemispheres, nothing very substantial. And when we say one hemisphere does dominate a function, it actually tends to be more of a slight bias for that side of the brain, not a huge absolute difference. So hemispheric specialization is more like a statistical phenomenon than an absolute difference. At any rate, this final diagram here, it actually gives some examples where one hemisphere may have some dominance, though again, it may be a small difference, just a relative dominance. Like with vision, for example, the left side is more active than the right for visually processing words and letters. But the right side's relatively more active if we're looking at a face or a geometric pattern visually. What about for hearing? Well, when it comes to hearing, language sounds activate the left side of our brain more, and non-language sounds or music activate the right part more. For touch, though, we tend to rely a little heavier on the right side overall, again, relatively speaking. For verbal aspects of memory, those tend to be more on the left, and of course, most of our language functions are left dominant, as we've already seen, like speaking, reading, writing, even arithmetic, though that one's a little more subtle. But when we read something emotional, that's still a language thing, right? But now it's emotional language. The right hemisphere is actually doing a little heavier lifting on the emotional parts of our speaking or reading. And a lot of, heavily spatial tasks like geometry or mentally rotating objects like Tetris pieces, the right hemisphere is relatively more active for that. But again, don't get too caught up on this idea of hemispheric specialization that you take it too far. For example, we could give someone a couple of very straightforwardly spatial tasks, right? And you might think, oh, spatial, that's kind of more of a right hemisphere thing. So we give them these two spatial tasks. Maybe one, we ask them to judge which object is above versus below, flash something, which object is above. Or a different, really simple spatial task, we could just ask them to judge how close two objects are to each other. So both of those are spatial tasks. You might think they're both right hemisphere things, but for the above versus below judgment, the left hemisphere is actually a bit better, a bit faster in reaction time. And for judging how close two things are, the right hemisphere is actually a bit better, a bit faster. And that's, again, both of those are spatial tasks. So in a more nuanced reality, it's not really broad cognitive categories that have hemispheric specialization, but smaller cognitive elements and smaller processes. That's why even though we say, as sort of a shorthand, we say language is mostly a left hemisphere thing, you can say that's not always the case, that there are at least some aspects of language. We see one here, there are others, but some aspects of language that happen on the right. And as we'll see later, there are all sorts of connections between the left and the right hemisphere in a normal brain with the corpus callosum, so that when we're doing language tasks, there's a whole network of areas throughout the brain on the left and some on the right side that work together to do language. All right, well, in this video here, in the next one, we'll see a few of the most common kind of modern methods used in cognitive neuroscience, like brain imaging, right, brain scanning, or brain manipulation, and maybe some of the things we can learn through those methods.